Imagine controlling 90% of an entire nation's lifeblood. Now, imagine the government stepping in, declaring your empire an illegal monster, and smashing it into 34 separate pieces to destroy you. Most empires would crumble, but for this man, it was the greatest payday in human history. When the dust settled, he didn't just
he became
survive,
the world's very
he
first
became
billionaire.
the world's very first
This
billionaire.
is his psychological blueprint.
This is the
When the
psychological
dust settled,
blueprint of
he
John
became
D.
the world's
Rockefeller.
very first billionaire.
A man sculpted
This was a man
not by
sculpted by a
corporate
ruthless
boardrooms,
philosophy
but by
born
a
in
ruthless
deception.
philosophy born in the shadows of deception. Long before he ruled the American economy, young John was a student in a brutal masterclass run by his own father. William Devil Bill Rockefeller wasn't an ordinary man. He was a literal traveling con artist who sold colored water as a miracle cancer cure. He wore masks for a living, once even pretending to be a deaf-mute beggar just to overhear local farmers' secrets and swindle them out of their land. Devil Bill treated his own family like marks in a game. He famously coaxed a young John to jump from a high chair into his arms, only to step back at the last second. As the boy crashed onto the floorboards, the father whispered the only lesson that mattered: never trust anyone completely, not even me. When Devil Bill eventually fled the country to live a double life under a fake name, he left his family penniless. But he left John with an unbreakable armor, the belief that the world was a battlefield, divided strictly into predators and prey. John became obsessed with the only entity that never lied: numbers. By age 25, John had weaponized this obsession. Entering the chaotic gold rush world of early oil refining, he looked at his competitors and saw amateur hour. In the 1860s, refining was incredibly wasteful. Rivals only cared about kerosene, dumping the byproduct, gasoline, naphtha, and chemical sludge, straight into the rivers. Rockefeller looked at that polluted water and saw a fortune washing away. He hired top chemists to transform that useless sludge into lubricating oil and paraffin wax. He bought his own forest to build his own barrels, cutting out every single middleman. By the time he was 30, he didn't just own a refinery, he owned the entire supply chain. But efficiency was just step one. To truly dominate, he needed to control the veins of the nation, the railroads. Rockefeller approached the railroad kings with a terrifyingly brilliant proposition. He guaranteed them massive, steady volumes of cargo in exchange for a secret weapon known as the drawback. It was a legal assassination mechanism. Every single time a competitor shipped a barrel of oil on those tracks, the railroad took a percentage of that competitor's money and handed it directly to Rockefeller. He was literally building his empire using his rival's own cash. His negotiation strategy was chillingly simple. He would invite rivals to his office, lay out the numbers, and calmly explain that they were already bankrupt. They just didn't know it yet. If they refused to sell out to him, they vanished from the market. In one legendary 48-hour window, he swallowed 6 competing refineries back to back. Within months, nearly the entire city of Cleveland had surrendered to the Standard Oil anaconda. As his empire grew to a scale American law had never anticipated, state regulators tried to block him. A company in one state wasn't legally allowed to own stock in another. So, Rockefeller's legal team invented a ghost called the trust. They pooled the assets of 40 different companies into a labyrinth of paperwork controlled by 9 trustees. If the government asked who owned a specific refinery, the paper trail led into a black hole. Standard Oil became an invisible deity, controlling global illumination from a single building in New York. Rockefeller famously optimized his empire down to the atom, once ordering a factory to use exactly 39 drops of solder to seal oil tins instead of 40, saving a fortune across millions of units. He flooded global markets, giving away millions of free lamps in China just to ensure they would have to buy his oil to keep them lit. He drove the price of light down by over 70%, allowing the global working class to afford literacy after sunset for the first time in human history. But absolute power breeds absolute hatred. By the early 1900s, the stress of running a hated monopoly began eating Rockefeller from the inside out. He developed alopecia, losing every strand of hair on his body, and was reduced to a ghostly figure living on crackers and milk. Then came Ida Tarbell. The daughter of an oilman ruined by Standard Oil, she spent years unearthing the secret contracts, the espionage networks, and the scandalous truth about Rockefeller's con artist father. Her explosive journalism gave the public a face to hate and handed President Theodore Roosevelt the ammunition to launch an all-out antitrust war. In 1911, the Supreme Court delivered the final blow. Standard Oil was ordered to be broken up and destroyed. The public cheered, believing the tyrant was dethroned. They didn't understand the math. When the monopoly was shattered into 34 separate companies, which would later become household names like Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, Rockefeller retained his proportional shares in all of them. Free from the legal shackles of the trust, and perfectly timed with the dawn of the automotive gasoline age, the value of those individual stocks exploded. By 1916, his net worth crossed the mythical $1 billion mark, equivalent to nearly 1.5% of the entire U.S. economy. The government's attempt to crush him had accidentally made him the richest man on earth. In his final years, Rockefeller faced the only enemy he couldn't buy: time. He hired the world's first public relations experts to scrub the blood from his name. The predatory tycoon transformed into a kindly grandfather who handed out shiny dimes to children on the street. He poured hundreds of millions into founding the University of Chicago and funding medical research that eradicated deadly diseases worldwide. Was it genuine remorse, or the final brilliant transaction of a master strategist who knew that history is written by the winners? When the machine finally stopped, in 1937 at the age of 97, John D. Rockefeller left behind a legacy that still dictates how modern global capitalism operates. Imagine controlling 90% of an entire nation's lifeblood, holding the literal power to plunge a continent into absolute darkness or light it on fire at your whim. Now, imagine the highest forces of government stepping in, declaring your empire an illegal monster, and systematically smashing it into 34 separate pieces with the explicit goal of destroying you forever. Most empires would crumble into dust under that kind of pressure. But for this man, the systematic demolition of his life's work became the greatest, most lucrative payday in human history. When the dust finally settled over the courtroom battlefields, he didn't just survive. He rewrote the rules of global wealth and stood alone as the world's very first confirmed billionaire. This is the psychological blueprint of John D. Rockefeller, a man whose mind was sculpted not within the predictable walls of corporate boardrooms, but by a ruthless, haunting philosophy born in the deepest shadows of deception and betrayal. Long before he ever ruled the American economy, young John was the primary student in a brutal, everyday master class run by his own father. William Devil Bill Rockefeller wasn't just an ordinary stern patriarch. He was a literal traveling con artist, a ghostly predator who made a living selling colored water as a miracle cure to desperate, dying cancer patients. He wore identities like clothes, once even pretending to be a completely deaf-mute beggar just to overhear local farmers' secrets and ultimately swindle them out of their ancestral land. Devil Bill treated his own flesh and blood like marks in an ongoing game of survival, famously coaxing a young, trusting John to jump from a high chair into his open arms, only to step back at the very last fractions of a second. As the young boy crashed violently onto the bare wooden floorboards, bruised and shocked, the father knelt down and whispered the cold, defining lesson that would govern the rest of John's life. Never trust anyone completely, not even me.